September, it's back to school season, and today you'll be learning what your kids or siblings are learning in school, Illegal Drugs 101. I'm Julie Hartman, and this is Timeless. Hey everyone, welcome to Timeless. Thanks so much for being here. Just as a reminder, this Julie Hartman YouTube channel has a lot of content besides Timeless. Timeless is Tuesdays, Wednesdays, Thursdays. It premieres at 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 o'clock Eastern. But also, you can check out Dennis and Julie, my show with Dennis Prager, also on this YouTube channel at 1 o'clock Pacific, 4 p.m. Eastern. That's on Mondays. And then throughout the week, I post various Julie noted news videos about timely developments. So it's great to be with you. You can follow me at Julie R. Hartman on Instagram and Twitter. And just on top of that, if you want more contact, you can email me at julie@hartman.com. You know, we started the show by playing the Beatles song, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. And I have something to admit. And I'd be really curious to know if I'm the only person who had this experience. I was listening to that song a few weeks ago, and I thought, wow, this is a really good song, but it's kind of, the lyrics are a little bit weird, kind of outlandish, but I didn't put two and two together that it's a song about drugs. And then when I was doing research for this episode, on some website that I was looking at, there was a note that said, you know, apropos of the Beatles song, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, which is about LSD. And I went, what? It's about LSD? Was I the only one? That's what I said. Ah, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, LSD, yes. No, I had that moment. I had that moment when I read it, and I felt like an idiot. And suddenly all of the lyrics made sense. Not that I've done LSD, to clarify, because my mother is watching, among others. I've not done that, but the lyrics and the acronym made sense. So please tell me if I'm just the only one, if I'm just a fool and didn't realize that that's what the song was about. But hey, still a good song. This is that moment for me, realizing that Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds was about LSD, was going on YouTube and watching Shrek compilations of all the things that you as a kid missed in Shrek. There are all of these adult jokes that are so funny. And as an adult, you watch them and go, God, how did that go over my head? Anyway, you know what today's about, Illegal Drugs 101. I do have a point of view about this, meaning the presence of illegal drugs and whether they should be no longer illegal, whether they should be legalized. And you might be able to understand my point of view as the show goes on. But really what today is about is providing you with information about illegal drugs, because we really don't know very much about them as Americans. And the problem of drug use and abuse is only growing. In fact, it is skyrocketing. So today I'm going to divide this episode into three categories for talking about illegal drugs. First, how to think about it legally. Second, how to think about these illegal substances chemically or medically. And then the third thing is thinking about them demographically, what their presence and their use is doing to the U.S. population. But first, legally. Illegal drugs are drugs that have been prohibited under international drug control and are also illegal under the various laws of whatever country you're living in our case, the United States. In the United States, illegal drugs are those that have been scheduled or listed, but the term here is scheduled, under Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 of the Controlled Substances Act. Actually, the Controlled Substances Act has 5 schedules or lists, but we're going to focus on Schedules 1 and Schedules 2 today. Schedule 1 drugs are those drugs that the federal government believes has no currently accepted medical use, that they have a lack of accepted safety for use, and also they have a high potential for abuse. So even under medical supervision, they have no medical benefit, only something that can potentially harm you. Schedule 1 drugs, to provide some examples, are heroin, LSD, ecstasy, Molly, cocaine, and even in the United States today, marijuana. Although marijuana has been legalized in, I think, just about half of U.S. states. I think the number is 21 states, and Washington, D.C., as of the time of filming this episode, have legalized marijuana. But still, under Schedule A, marijuana is classified as under Schedule 1, marijuana has been classified as an illegal drug. So those are Schedule 1 drugs. Schedule 2 drugs are drugs that have an acceptable use, primarily a medical use, but they have a very high risk of abuse and physical or psychological dependence. So Schedule 2 drugs aren't technically illegal, but there are roadblocks to getting them in the sense that you need a doctor to prescribe or supervise your use of them, and you need to monitor your use very closely. So examples of Schedule 2 drugs are oxycodone, morphine, opium, codeine, and fentanyl. We're going to be talking about fentanyl later in the show. People think that fentanyl is an illegal substance. It's something that is put into drugs that is causing all of these overdoses. And it is true that fentanyl is put into drugs illegally because people don't know when they're taking the drugs that the drug also has fentanyl in it. And it is true that fentanyl is causing all of these terrible overdoses in the United States. But it's actually not true that fentanyl is illegal. You can get fentanyl if you have a doctor's prescription in order to ease pain, and it is quite frequently actually used. Oftentimes, when illegal drugs are discussed, proponents of drug legalization put forth the argument that the most abused substance in the United States isn't drugs, it's alcohol. And that is absolutely, undeniably true. 15 million Americans over the age of 15 suffer from a diagnosable alcohol use disorder, and 95,000 Americans die from alcohol-related causes annually. So alcohol-related causes doesn't necessarily mean that that person overdoses, but maybe they got behind the wheel and was drunk driving and they died from the impact of crashing their car. Or maybe they had alcohol over a prolonged period of their life and suffered from liver damage, which caused them to die. So nearly 100,000 Americans die from those alcohol-related causes a year. And interestingly and staggeringly, 14,000 Americans, as of 2019, die directly from alcohol overdose. That is up from 6,000, roughly, who died in 1990 of alcohol overdose. So clearly it is true that alcohol is the most abused substance in the United States, but I've never really understood that argument as a credible challenge to the drug legalization question, because the question is, what is our response to this phenomenon that alcohol is the most abused drug? Should it be that because there's a huge alcohol abuse problem that we should allow Americans to just abuse other things like drugs? The argument, and it's a libertarian argument, is that, well, why is the government allowing you to abuse some things like alcohol, but they're not allowing you to abuse other things like drugs? And it's an intellectually valid argument. The person, the libertarian who would be making that argument is right, that the government is inconsistent. But despite being intellectually valid, that is a practically horrible position to take, because when you legalize more things, it just means that more people are going to abuse those things, and it's going to lead to more misery and death and destruction. So personally, I would rather have a government that's a bit inconsistent and allowing you to abuse one thing and not other things than a consistent government who's allowing you to abuse all these things, and it leads to many of the catastrophes and tragedies that we are seeing now. Just my 2 cents. So let's talk about drugs medically and chemically, what they can do to you. We know that there is a legal way to classify drugs in the United States. It's Schedule 1 and Schedule 2 under the Controlled Substances Act. And there are many other different ways to classify drugs. Depending on what source or website you go to, they can divide them into 7 categories, 10 categories. I'm going to focus on 3: stimulants, depressants, and hallucinogens. Those are just the most basic divisions, and they indicate what they do to you. And oftentimes, there's an overlap. Some drugs are both stimulants and hallucinogens, for instance. Stimulants are drugs that amp you up, that give you energy and make you more active. For instance, cocaine. That's why many of the people on Wall Street in the 90s, and probably today, though they don't want to admit it, would snort coke at 2 o'clock in the morning because they're working these crazy jobs at these crazy firms and they need to stay up. So cocaine is a classic example of a stimulant. A depressant depresses your inhibitions. That's where the word comes from. It lowers your inhibitions. And oftentimes what that means is that it makes you more relaxed. So alcohol is a classic depressant. When you want to relax, you go out to dinner and you pour yourself a glass of wine. But it's important to know with depressants that it is not necessarily the case that the depressant drug will relax you or calm you down. The word, as I said, depressant, means that it depresses your inhibitions. So if you are a violent person, for instance, and you consume alcohol, you are actually more likely to be violent. It's not that you'll become relaxed. You will be more likely to act out on your violent impulses. Why? Because the alcohol is depressing your inhibition and making you feel like it is a good idea to engage in that violent, amped up activity. What alcohol does, like many depressants, is that whatever you've pressed down into the cellar or the basement of your psyche, whatever things you don't want to convey to other people or wear on your sleeve, alcohol and other depressants brings those things up. And then finally, hallucinogens, probably pretty easy to explain, easy for you to infer, refers to those drugs which interfere with your senses, your sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell, and they distort reality, hence the word hallucinate in that. So stimulants, depressants, and hallucinogens, as aforementioned, a lot of drugs actually fit into both categories. For instance, marijuana is both a depressant and a hallucinogen. Today, we're going to talk about weed, heroin, cocaine, fentanyl, oxycodone, ecstasy, and LSD. I want to profile those because those are the most abused drugs by every source that I consulted with here in the United States. It is difficult to say which of those is the most lethal drug because that depends on how many people took the drug and how many people overdosed on it. And it's really difficult to know that because people aren't exactly going out of their way to self-report that they did heroin last night. And it also, you have to do these kind of proportions of, again, how many people took versus how many people overdosed. So it's very difficult to find out. But across the board, those are the drugs that people agree are the most abused. Also, a quick note about lethality of drugs. It is a common argument, or reality, if you will, for people to say that weed is not a lethal drug because there's no known overdose amount for THC. LSD is another drug that people say is not lethal, but that isn't exactly accurate because, as mentioned a few moments ago in the discussion of alcohol, even if you're not overdosing from certain drugs, drugs can be lethal in the sense that they make you do things and engage in behavior that would not be in accordance with behavior you would engage in if you had clear judgment. So for instance, sadly, tragically, we're seeing this more these days. People who go on weed, some of them get so paranoid and so intense in their sensations that they kill themselves. There was a story of a 19-year-old boy who was so high on marijuana and he convinced himself that he had ruined his life and that his life wasn't going anywhere and that people were following him, and he tragically threw himself out of a window. So it's not exactly accurate to say, for instance, that marijuana isn't a lethal drug because it sure can lead you to do pretty lethal things. So let's start with that drug, marijuana, which is under Schedule 1 of the Substance or the Controlled Substances Act, which means that there is a high potential for abuse. We all know that there is an argument nowadays that you can't become addicted to marijuana That is not true. Marijuana is a dry, shredded, green and brown mix of flower stems, seeds, and leaves from the cannabis sativa plant, which is indigenous to Eastern Asia. Amazingly, many of the drugs that exist and that we will be discussing come from plants that you can walk by, depending on where you are in the world, and pick and have for yourself. It's just, you think of drugs, and many are concocted in a lab, but you think of them as like the work of scientists. But you can actually harvest and grow your own marijuana if you buy the cannabis sativa plant. You can smoke, vape, edible, take marijuana, weed, and it relaxes you, it disinhibits you, it increases your appetite, it can sedate you, but also it can really severely affect your memory and learning and retention. And over time, there's a lot of evidence that prolonged marijuana use can actually exacerbate or bring up latent disorders that you may have a genetic or family history of, and that the weed, the marijuana, can actually make it more common for those psychiatric disorders to come into effect. So we're seeing people who have prolonged marijuana use who are exhibiting signs of schizophrenia or of bipolar disorder, which they never had prior to taking the weed. So with this argument that weed is somehow not addictive, I'd like to ask you, because I'm sure you have heard this before, I'd like to ask you, does your lived experience substantiate that claim that weed is not addictive? My lived experience sure as heck does not substantiate that. I have witnessed a lot of people in my life who have either really come close to ruin their lives or ruin their lives as a result of a marijuana addiction. Schedule 1, as said, has marijuana under the criteria of high potential for abuse. Of course, that's not the same as addiction, but it has the same effect of you getting hooked to it. And the CDC, remarkably, says that 3 in 10 of those who use marijuana have marijuana use disorder. And we see that a lot of celebrities use marijuana and by all signs become addicted to it. For instance, the toxicology report on Whitney Houston, who died about a decade ago at the Beverly Hilton Hotel, showed that she died of prescription drugs, cocaine, and marijuana. And as I said, there are all these stories of people going to the emergency room, being paranoid. There was actually an incident a few months ago near the studio at the Van Nuys Elementary School where these kids had to be sent to the hospital because they were displaying these signs of frenzy, of paranoia. So it is a total misrepresentation to say that marijuana is just benign. And now that we have all of these weed stores seemingly on every corner around the country, we're going to see even more and more of this addiction. Heroin. Next, heroin is a depressant. It depresses your inhibitions. It's actually a drug that is extracted from certain poppy plants. There's a really cool clip, if not a little depressing, because it shows people in South America making a living off of creating this horrible drug. But it's a very, very interesting exploration into how you go from a poppy plant to a drug like heroin. Let's watch.
Nearly all heroin destined for America comes from drug cartels in Mexico and Colombia. It starts with the seed of an opium poppy, planted, then harvested 3 months later. The seed pods are sliced, releasing a milky fluid that turns dark and sticky. This is raw opium in its simplest form. Once extracted, it's taken to labs, where the opium is mixed with hot water to release the key ingredient, morphine. Various chemicals are added, and after several days, the clay-like morphine base is dried and turned into powdery heroin.
The effects of heroin is that you have this initial surge of euphoria or rush, but then it is followed by these days of sleeplessness where people feel like they're in this twilight state of sleep and wakefulness, but really they're not sleeping. And one of the biggest groups that abuses heroin are homeless people. And so sometimes when you see homeless people walking around at night and they have that horrible look of tiredness, it's because the heroin is keeping them awake. When you overdose on heroin, like many other drug overdoses, it is like a total breakdown, the most terrifying breakdown of your body. You have this slow and shallow breathing. You have basically respiratory collapse. Your lips turn blue and you get cold. Your fingernails also turn blue. Clammy skin. You start to have convulsions. Many people go into a coma and die. Some of the people, well-known people who have died of heroin overdose, are Kurt Cobain, Chris Farley, and perhaps most famously, Philip Seymour Hoffman. Cocaine is another drug that is abused, and it is a stimulant. So, as said, the Wall Street people often sniff it so that they can stay up late at night. It's a white crystalline powder that's derived from another plant, coca leaves, actually. And it is refined to make up this white rock like feel. People actually figured out how to extract cocaine from coca leaves 150 years ago. And you know what they did with it, among other things? They put it into Coca-Cola in the 19th century. So when you opened a can of Coca-Cola in the 1800s, you were drinking cocaine, hence the name Coca-Cola. Finally, the FDA and the federal government in the United States figured this out and banned it in 1914, and then Coca-Cola came out again with a non-cocaine-based drink. 900 pounds of coca leaves are needed in order to just make 1 kilogram of cocaine. And as I said, coca leaves are transformed to make this drug. They're soaked in water, acid, and bleach that draws the drug out of the leaves. And then people mix that with gasoline and other chemicals. There's another clip of how this is done in South America. Let's see.
And what they're doing is that they're removing the top of it, which is the fuel. And the bottom is a clear sort of liquid, and that's where the drugs remain. So you see it's pretty dark. And that's all the gasoline. And the clear part now underneath. Yes, okay. So, yeah, that's the drugs right there. So they call that clear liquid, they call it the soup.
Like heroin, if you were to draw the sensations that you feel when you're on cocaine on a graph, it would look something like the graph going really, really, really up high and then really, really, really down low. In the case of heroin, as I said, it's a depressant, so it gives you this sense of relaxation and euphoria, but then it's followed by several hours, if not days, of sleeplessness. With cocaine, because it's a stimulant, it gives you this high of energy and feeling like you're on top of the world, but then there's a crash after cocaine, which entails mental and physical exhaustion. Like heroin, sometimes, despite this exhaustion, you can't sleep because the chemicals in your body are actually latently amping you up. And people actually fall into a depression because it's very difficult for your hormones to have those highs and lows, highs and lows, highs and lows. And it can really, with weed too, affect your mental health and actually bring out certain psychiatric disorders. Following the crash, users tend to crave cocaine again. And then they have cocaine again and they need more because their tolerance is built up, and that's how it leads to cocaine abuse and, tragically, cocaine overdose. 1 million Americans abuse cocaine every year. And actually, cocaine abuse is involved in about half of the 1.3 million annual trips to the emergency room that involve drug abuse. Long-term users of cocaine have horrible respiratory problems, and if you chronically snort cocaine, you can actually have an erosion of the upper nasal cavity of your nose. And when you overdose on cocaine, nasal can probably do horrible things to your navel cavity too. But yes, thank you, Sean, nasal. When you overdose on cocaine, there are two things that are common. You can either go into cardiac arrest because of increased heart rate from the energy, or decreased blood pressure, or you can have a stroke from cerebral microvascular damage because the drug is interfering with blood flow to the brain. So it's like bad or really bad. Which one would you rather have? My gosh, you either have cardiac arrest or stroke. Whitney Houston, River Phoenix, and John Belushi are among the celebrities which tragically faced these effects. The latter two, River Phoenix and John Belushi, had cocaine and heroin in their systems at the same time. Moving on to fentanyl, a depressant, which, as I said, is actually legal and is used quite frequently and quite effectively in order to mitigate pain when it is prescribed by doctors. Fentanyl is a small white powder. It is a synthetic opioid drug that is approved by the FDA. It is 100 times more potent than morphine and 50 times more potent than heroin as a pain reliever. And like many other pain medications, you feel euphoria, your pain is mitigated, you can relax. People feel like they're high when they have the drug because they feel so great. So fentanyl, unlike the other drugs, is actually made by a combination of chemicals in labs, so it doesn't come from a plant. And we're seeing that China is especially adept at making or assembling these chemicals, which turn out to be fentanyl. Fentanyl is the number one cause of death in the United States for Americans aged 18 to 45. It wasn't always this way, but over the past few years, as we have let China come in to our country and as we have, allowed the southern border to be an utter mess, fentanyl has come through with a lot of ease, causing just these terrible, terrible overdoses. A size of a grain of sand can kill you. And so what China does is that they make the precursors or the chemical components of the fentanyl. They sell it to primarily Mexican drug cartels or other Latin American drug cartels. They put the components together to make the fentanyl, and then they put the fentanyl into other drugs such as cocaine and heroin, and then they funnel it across the southern border, and Americans die from it. This is the point, I think, of China making the fentanyl. It is to kill people. It is to kill Americans. They're seeing that it is killing Americans. 106,000 Americans died in 2022 of drug overdoses. That is the equivalent of having a 9/11-like event happen every week. And so China may not be landing battalions or bringing soldiers or planes or ships to our soil to engage in warfare, but this is an all-out act of warfare, let us be clear. And it is an eerily brilliant one because it's done clandestinely. When you overdose from fentanyl, you go into coma, you have respiratory failure, and oftentimes you end up choking on your own vomit. You could see I said that slowly because I was trying to find a way to say it in a not so overt way, but that is what happens. And you know what? It's good to say overtly what happens because people need to be aware and even scared, because now it is really common that if you go out and buy cocaine, it's pretty likely that your cocaine may not be the pure cocaine that you think that you are buying. The singer Prince actually died from fentanyl overdose. He thought that he was taking Vicodin, which is a prescription painkiller, and had fentanyl of it in it. Speaking of prescription painkillers, another most abused drug in the United States is oxycodone, unsurprisingly a depressant. It is a semi-synthetic narcotic that comes from modifying opium. By the way, oftentimes people use the word narcotics when they are referring to illegal drugs in general. That's become a synonym of illegal drugs. But technically, narcotics are only opium or opium derivatives like heroin or like oxycodone. You consume oxycodone either through pills or intravenously. Gives you a lot of pain relief, sedation, but also respiratory depression, constipation, and brain collapse sometimes. If you take these pills a lot, it can actually dull your senses, your ability to respond quickly. 2 million people misuse prescription painkillers annually. And although these are not prescription painkillers, there are these drugs that are called benzos, such as Xanax, for instance. Xanax is a sleep medication. It can also be used to mitigate pain, but primarily psychological pain. And it's a opium derivative. 16% of all recorded opium overdose deaths involve a benzo medication. That is from the Drug Abuse Institute. All of these drugs, these opium drugs or derivatives, can cause severe liver damage, muscle weakness, slow breathing, and coma. And oftentimes, when someone overdoses on oxycodone, unlike other drugs where you have a heart attack, it comes from suffocation because your breathing slows so much and you can't get enough oxygen. Heath Ledger is one of the celebrities that overdosed on oxycodone. And then the final two drugs, among the most abused in the United States, are ecstasy and LSD. Ecstasy is a depressant and a hallucinogen. It produces this energizing effect. It distorts time and perception, and it enhances your enjoyment of tactile experiences such as touch or smell or your sight, your perception of color. Oftentimes people say that it transforms the surroundings around you to be so much more fascinating and enjoyable. Let's listen to a drug expert talk about the effects of ecstasy.
You know, it makes you feel ultra connected to everything and everybody, and everything is fascinating, and you could sit there for hours and just pet the couch because it feels smooth. And, you know, somebody combing your hair or giving you a back rub is just absolutely amazing because there's this sense of wonderment.
There's a funny story from college days that one of my friends told me. I was not present for this, but she went to a party and she was a little tipsy, and she on a table saw a circular pill looking object that had an E. And she looked at it and she went, "Oh my God, there's ecstasy on the table at this party. Oh my gosh, like I'm not gonna take it, but wow, this looks cool that there's ecstasy." And she said that it was a red pill. Turns out they discovered that it was an M&M just turned on its side. And my friend in her drunken state thought that it was ecstasy, but it was literally just an M&M flipped over. I guess that's what happens to you when you're on a depressant like alcohol. Depresses your inhibitions and your ability to recognize an M&M that is just turned on its side. Funny story, but what's not so funny is what happens to you when you go on ecstasy and in the case of taking too much. Your heart rate and blood pressure goes up. Sometimes people say it feels like being trapped in a nightmare, where it can go one way where you have these hallucinations that are so fun, and like that person was saying, you're petting a couch and you think it's cool, but sometimes depending on your chemical makeup, it can go the other way where you are having a terrible experience, where the couch is not fun to pet, where it's spiky and you think that it's a demon that is coming at you. And what ecstasy can also do is it can create tremors and muscle tensions, and it can interfere with your body's ability to regulate temperature. So in the case of ecstasy overdose, which admittedly is rare, but nevertheless still happens, what happens is that people have either hyperthermia or hypothermia. They become either too hot or too cold, and the death results from the inability to regulate that situation. All of these drugs have a different flavor, if you will, of the terrible side effects. And it just is worth talking about because a lot of people focus on the different flavors of the high of the drug, what it can make you feel. But we don't really discuss how awful in many different ways misuse of this drug can get. And then finally, there's LSD, apparently memorialized or celebrated in a Beatles song, Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds. LSD, I also didn't know this, I'm learning a lot through this episode, comes in these patches that can have designs. They look like stamps of Mickey Mouse or some fun drawing, a mountain. Again, they look like stamps. It's actually very uncommon for people to overdose on LSD directly. And LSD is made in a lab, but it actually comes from something a little more interesting. Not just a plant, but fungus on a plant, specifically on rye plants. LSD was first synthesized in 1938 from fungus that grew on rye. And actually in 1943, so 10 years or 5 years later, the inventor Albert Hofmann accidentally touched some to his mouth of this fungus on rye when he was experimenting, and he got high, and that's how LSD was born. The experimenter just accidentally went tripping on LSD. Some people say that the Salem witch trials were caused because these women went and somehow consumed fungus from the rye plants that they were tending to, but that seems sort of like a conspiracy theory, but nevertheless one worth conveying. So LSD is available in this saturated, absorbent paper, and they're called microdots, or these sugar cube looking things. They can also be dissolved into liquid form, and you inhale them or bite into them. Your pupils become dilated, your body pressure becomes really high, your heart rate becomes really high, your blood pressure becomes really high, you start sweating, you have a loss of appetite, sleeplessness, dry mouth, and tremors. And while under the influence, you can have, similar to ecstasy, these vastly, vastly distorted perceptions of the shape and size of objects. You don't have any sense of time. You see colors in a much more vivid way. You hear sounds in a much more vivid way. And you can even have such distorted perception that human beings don't even look like human beings. They look like Picasso paintings or these blobs of goop. And the scary thing is, as fun as that may seem in the moment, is that there's actually an increasing phenomenon with regard to LSD that's called hallucinogen persisting perception disorder, which is everyone's worst nightmare, in the sense that the drug with this disorder doesn't wear off. You are perpetually in this trapped state of being on the drug. Sometimes people have kind of a half and half, where they come down from the high of the drug, but then in their everyday life, even weeks after they consumed LSD, they have these fragmentary recurrences of certain aspects of being on the drug, like flashbacks to certain perceptions that they had. And people, as I said, this can happen days, weeks, and even months after people have LSD because of the potency. It's very difficult to know with many other drugs in addition to LSD how much you are taking, because it's not regulated and it comes in these different doses. So how is all of this information available? Well, there are actually these labs in the United States that pay you to take these various drugs, and they put electrodes on your head, on your brain, and they do these PET scans to try to see what the hallucinating mind is like. And oftentimes they find that these psychedelics, there's a through line where they overstimulate serotonin receptors in the brain. They do it in different ways, but then those lead to those differing consequences. And the thing that's interesting about these labs that can pay you to get high all day is that it raises a similar debate as organ donation, for instance. There's an argument that part of liberty is allowing people to engage in these things if they want to make money and deem that an acceptable way to make money. But there's also an argument that it's coercive, that a way to make money in the United States should not be forcing people to potentially mess up their brain or have this permanent surgery from where you are extracting an organ. So that these hallucinating labs are under fire for allegedly coercing people to mess with themselves in order to just have some cash. So if you use these drugs, you fall into three categories: a user, an abuser, or, sorry to get so down, someone who dies. And the information and charts that I'm about to show you reveal that for all of the drugs that I talked about, all three of these are getting significantly worse. There are way more users, there are way more abusers, and there are way more people who are dying. All of this, the uptick in users, abusers, and deaths, are coinciding with increased availability of illegal drugs, decreased social stigma that is associated with taking illegal drugs, and either increased legalization or decreased criminalization or prosecution of these drugs. Some people will say, oh, well, heroin or cocaine isn't legal in the United States, but it matters how much the feds are going after people who use or sell cocaine and heroin. And over time, there's significant evidence that criminalization has gone down. So functionally, that serves as legalization. There's this great website called ourworldindata.org, which compares the United States and its drug and alcohol abuse trends to other countries around the world. And it is unbelievable. You look at the United States, and in every single chart, almost every single chart, we are the country that suffers from use disorders and overwhelming death and overdose rates as compared to other countries. Interesting tidbit, why the most developed, quote unquote, civilized country in the world is the one who is succumbing to this the most. So there's this argument pertaining to legalization that it will actually decrease abuse and it will decrease deaths. Why? Because through legalization, you allow these drugs to be legally manufactured and regulated, so people will know that their drug is totally kosher, doesn't have fentanyl in it that some shady Mexican drug cartel put into it. They'll know the exact dose of the drug. But alcohol sort of refutes this idea that legalization will mitigate these other effects like abuse and deaths. Because as alcohol has become legalized after prohibition, and as more people are having alcohol legally, we've seen, as mentioned earlier in the episode, that abuse and death rates are actually going up. There were approximately 6,000 Americans in the year 1990 who directly died of alcohol overdose. In 2019, that number was up double to 14,000. So kind of refutes that legalization argument. Also, I'm going to show these charts which show these various phenomenon with regard to drugs. Now, of course, a correlation doesn't mean causation. In other words, the presence of increased drug deaths or increased abuse doesn't necessarily mean that increased legalization or decreased criminalization is causing these phenomenon. But seems awfully likely, and a strong correlation is something significant. Let's look here at the rate of deaths attributed to drug use. In 1990, it was 8.5 per 100,000 people in the United States who died because of drug use. In 2019, that went up to 29.8 per 100,000. So it went up 3.5 times in the last 30 years. This is as more states have legalized drugs. Another chart shows drug use disorder death rate. So what makes this chart different from the preceding chart? This chart shows habitual users in their deaths, whereas the previous chart shows just general people who are using drugs and maybe dying from them. We see in this chart that for the habitual user in 2019, 2.06 per 100,000 habitual users died of drug overdose. In 2019, that went up to 18.83 per 100,000. So the overall drug-related death rate for the population in general has gone up 3 times. And then the habitual user has gone up 8 times. Significant? I think so. Another graph shows the share of population with drug use disorders. Drug use disorders are, quote, they're defined as, quote, continued use of a drug leading to impairments in health, social function, and control over substance use. In 1990, about 2.1% of Americans had, according to this definition, a drug use disorder. In 2019, that went up to 3.4%. Because those percentages are so low, it doesn't seem like a big increase. But the difference between 2.1 and 3.4 is about 75%. So it's gone up 75% in the past 30 years. Years ago, the writer Gore Vidal said that the worst effect of pornography is that it leads those who view it to consume even greater amounts of pornography. My research today on illegal drugs indicates that the same is true for those, that it leads those who have more access to it to use it and consume even greater amounts. In both cases, whether it's pornography or drugs, what's happening is that people are running away and escaping into a fantasy world because the real world is too uninteresting or unsatisfying or difficult or painful for them to handle. But the difficulty and pain in life, they are features of life. They're not bugs. They are just as much a part of life as the happy times. And as a society, we are moving more towards this panacea for pain and difficulty through escapism, whether it's porn, whether it's drugs, whether it's TV, scrolling endlessly on social media, virtual reality headsets where you can literally escape into a fantasy world of your own creation. But we all need to realize that there's not something wrong with us because we have difficulty and pain. It's just the way life is. And by going towards these things and using them constantly in order to mitigate that pain is actually only going to exacerbate it and make it way worse for all of us and for our society in general. Thank you for being here. I hope you enjoyed this episode and it was informative. Hit the subscribe button down below if you want to stay notified of all of the different content that I post. Take care, and I'll see you soon.